You are listening to a Clarkesworld Magazine podcast with your host and narrator, Kate Baker. Greetings, Clarkesworld citizens. I hope this podcast finds you extraordinarily well. This is our fifth story for the month of November, issue 170. I hope you're hanging in there. I want to thank you for spending your time here at Clarkesworld. And I want to encourage you to help support this magazine in any way you see fit, whether that is through word of mouth, a subscription, or going to patreon.com/Clarkesworld to pledge your support financially. So our fifth story is titled Niuniu and is by Baoshu and translated by Andy Dudak. Baoshu is a science fiction and fantasy writer. He has published 5 novels and dozens of shorter works since 2010, including 3 Body X, Redemption of Time, Ruins of Time, winner of the 2014 Chinese Nebula Award for Best Novel, 7 States of the Galaxy, Phantom from an Ancient Empire, and Everybody Loves Charles, winner of the 2015 Galaxy Award for Best Novella. He lives in Xi'an, China. And also by this author, go back to September 2015, Preserve Her Memory. January 2016 brought you Everybody Loves Charles, and January 2018 brought you The Lighthouse Girl. So without further ado, I hope you can sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. 1. Dong Feng still clearly remembers the joyous love of that rainy night. It seemed quite bad at first. After 3 years of dating and 2 years of marriage, their formerly shy and sweet explorations had become routine business. Nevertheless, he was in the mood that night. At 11 p.m., he turned off the light and got into bed. He embraced Shenlan's voluptuous form, and she lazily accepted this. He poured curious requests in her ear, but she refused, her patience waning. She said she was tired and told him to hurry up and finish so they could sleep. Dong Feng put forth his argument. You used to promise me things. How can you break your promises? He'd forgotten this was not a matter to be reasoned out. Sure enough, Shenlan launched her counterattack. You promised me things too, and what came of it? And now you have the nerve to ask me to... Contending with each other, they soon found new territory in the conjugal bed, from division of housework to their mortgage, from premarital promises to demanding parents-in-law. Dong Feng finally stormed out of the bedroom and went to the study to play a VR game. He massacred aliens to drain off his resentment. After the game, Dong Feng removed his helmet and heard a thunderclap through the rain-battered window. He rushed into the bedroom to find Shenlan awake, as expected, covering her ears, curled up with a blanket and tear-soaked pillow. Dong Feng knew she was afraid of thunder. She had been since childhood. And now, how long had she been in torment tonight? He had a soft spot for this phobia of hers, and declaring surrender, he pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be afraid, it's okay. Weeping, Shenlan beat him with light, quick blows. It's all your fault. I hate you so much. Yet she accepted his embrace with fervor. Their bodies relaxed and they were twisting together and growing once more taut like Tron bowstrings. Thunder and lightning swept over the city. Gale winds howled between buildings. Raindrops beat window panes. With mixed love and hatred, they dashed against each other, collided, fused, and clung to life's summit. I hadn't been so deeply satisfied in a long time and wouldn't be for ages to come. So Dong Feng is certain. That was the night they conceived Niuniu. Returning from work at 8:30, he opens their front door and sees little Niuniu amusing herself beside Shenlan's foot. She sees him, is immediately beaming and standing awkwardly. She staggers toward him, shouting, Papa! She grabs the hem of his jacket and he knows she wants to be held. He sets down his briefcase and picks her up, lifts her high. Niuniu shrieks excitedly, showing 2 rows of just grown-in teeth. Careful, Shenlan says. Please don't drop our child. Dongfeng reassures her and says, Hey, didn't you notice? Notice what? She can walk. Yesterday, she could go 2 or 3 steps at most. You saw her do more just now. She can go from one end of the room to the other. Dongfeng puts Niuniu down and she starts walking straight away. She can indeed stride, performing with a high and mighty air, though her knees still don't bend properly, so she can only proceed swaying comically like a penguin. After a few steps, she goes down, but luckily a floor mat cushions her fall. She gets up and changes direction, circling back around toward her parents. Shenlan shakes with laughter. Dongfeng gives a perfunctory smile, which gradually solidifies on his face, but Shenlan doesn't notice. Such a clever child, she says, nudging him. In a few more days, she'll have the run of the room. Or close to it, Dongfeng says, unable to stop himself. Isn't it like this every time? He immediately regrets it. Shenlan's smile vanishes. Her gaze goes gloomy and cold. Dongfeng wants to say something to allay the mood, but there's a muffled thump behind him. Niuniu has stepped on a stuffed animal and fallen. This time the fall was heavy. She banged her head and now she's wailing. Shenlan pushes past Dongfeng. She picks up and hugs the child. It's okay, darling. Mama's here. Mama. Niuniu babbles, burying her face in Shenlan's bosom. Shenlan goes on consoling her. She lowers her head to kiss the child, hair cascading like a waterfall to tickle Niuniu's face and provoke giggles. Dongfeng finds the whole tableau repellent. He stands in the far corner of the living room watching mother and daughter. In the faint lamplight, it's like a scene of the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus to her breast. 2. They knew they were having a girl when the first B ultrasound. Hospital regulations didn't permit them to ask, but it was only set up that way to increase gray income for doctors. The parents-to-be didn't broach the subject, but the doctor hinted. Although there were things the hospital wasn't allowed to reveal, if one wanted to know, it wasn't impossible. After that, he was silent. Actually, Dongfeng didn't especially want to know, but not asking seemed like it would be rude. So he flashed 100 yuan, and when the doctor didn't take it, he fished out another 100. The doctor said, Your child will take after her mother. Good news either way, I think, boy or girl, but of course, if you don't want her, there's something we can do. Dongfeng didn't value boys over girls, not as far as he knew himself. He didn't think male or female made much difference. The child was coming fast. He'd been dizzy since finding out, but after learning he would have a daughter, he couldn't help feeling disappointed. He realized he'd been hoping for a son deep down, for father and son racing VR cars at breakneck speed, battling alien monsters, pursuing the interests of boys and men. It was difficult to understand what a daughter would mean to him. Shenlan, however, was quite happy. Back outside, she said a girl was fine by her. A few days before, she'd thought of an especially nice girl's name. Dong Xinghuan, indicating the child would be beautiful like the famed poet and courtesan Dong Xiaohuan. The name also stealthily incorporated a line of the verse from the Book of Songs. There was a beauty all alone, pure, qing, and graceful, one. Dongfeng, not won over, said a boy could have a good name too, for instance, Dong Xihuan. Oh, what a mess, Shenlan said. Why not Dong Shisung, a kid named chairman of the board? Dongfeng laughed in exasperation. Gazing out the car window on the way home, he buried his non-existent son, Dong Xihuan. As for the child pet name, Shenlan had another good idea. Huanhuan. Unique and pleasant to the ear. The name actually moved Dongfeng as though a pretty and mild girl already stood before him. At that moment, they couldn't help recalling the first time he'd seen Shenlan. They'd been at university then. It had been a rainy day, and he'd come out of the library and spotted a young woman in a gauzy dress standing inside the entrance colonnade, sheltering from the rain. Her long hair lightly drifted. Faint anxiety was written on her face. She was like a lily in a misty rain. Dongfeng couldn't help stopping to look, and their gazes met. There seemed to be an expectation in the young woman's eyes, but she turned away shyly. Dongfeng's feet felt drawn toward her as if by magnetism. He didn't normally strike up conversations with female students. Also, he wouldn't know what to say. Maybe I could walk with her a bit, he thought. But no, she might be waiting for a friend or even a boyfriend. Who knew? Such a beautiful girl was not likely to be single. He chuckled bitterly, decided against folly, and turned to leave. Now, Dongfeng marvels at life, at how two people's fates, no, three people's, can be decided in an instant. If he indeed left that rainy day, everything would be different. Perhaps he would have emigrated or gone down south. Then he would not have come to the city and married this young woman named Shenlan. Of course, Niuniu would never have existed, and all that followed would not have happened. The smart kettle issues a gentle, happy note, indicating the water has boiled. Dongfeng emerges from foggy memories. He pours water in the baby's bottle, then mixes in powdered milk. Niuniu drinks powder imported from Australia, and the water is purified. It has to be maintained at 45 degrees. A difference of a few degrees won't do. Of course, these are not Niuniu's demands. She could make do with anything, but Shenlan's standards are high, bordering on immoderate. About done, Shenlan calls from the bedroom. Niuniu is quite hungry. The milk is not yet mixed. Dongfeng, in a fit of agitation, considers hurling the bottle at a wall and smashing it to pieces, but he endures. He shakes the milk until it's ready and takes it to the bedroom. Niuniu has just been bathed. She's playing with Shenlan on the bed, rolling about and sucking her finger. She sees him coming with the bottle and sits up, bright-eyed. Dongfeng is a few seconds late handing the bottle over, and she starts crying. Shenlan hastily takes the bottle. She holds Niuniu and lets her suckle. Niuniu drinks, glancing sidelong at Dongfeng, tears still streaming. There seems a sly and cunning light in her eyes. 3. Niuniu grew up on milk. Shenlan's milk was lacking, and though she tried breastfeeding at first, the child was always up late fussing and crying. Husband and wife believed she was sick until they realized she was just never full. Finally, they started relying on milk powder. It was probably guilt that drove Shenlan to shop online for expensive overseas powdered milk, while still breastfeeding as much as possible. Their daughter's formal name was fixed as Dong Xinghuang, but her childhood pet name soon changed from Wanwan to Niuniu. They'd hire a nanny for the first month confinement, and this woman, according to a naming custom of her home province, called her Niuniu now and then. Dongfeng's parents were also staying with them at the time, helping to look after the baby. They loved the new name and started using it. Dongfeng followed suit. Maybe it was because Wanwan sounded too profound and elegant, suitable for the tender sentiment of a lover, but not quite fitting for a little girl, far inferior to the light, catchy cliché that was Niuniu. Shenlan wasn't crazy about this. She announced her daughter's primary pet name was still Wanwan. That Niuniu was merely secondary. After this declaration, she herself started using Niuniu. No one spent further thought on primary versus secondary names. Child rearing was difficult and joyous. Days seemed like years, yet they were fleeting. Niuniu could laugh. Niuniu could roll over. Niuniu could sit up. Dongfeng and Shenlan watched their daughter go from plump little larva to crawling kitten and a walking, talking girl who liked pretty clothes and admiring herself in the mirror. Almost every day there was a pleasant new surprise. Dongfeng had felt he couldn't be close to a daughter, but he immediately loved the little lady. Niuniu also got stuck on him. Seeing her papa, she would smile sweetly. A hug from him could stop her wailing. Sometimes she even needed his company to sleep, which made Shenlan quite jealous. There was their family's golden age. Later, Dongfeng often wondered when it started to go amiss. Perhaps it was the day in the cafe. Niuniu had just turned 1. A client had made an appointment to meet with Dongfeng, but it was too late. Dongfeng waited in the cafe, saw a second-hand book on a bookshelf titled Niuniu. Amused, he read a bit while drinking coffee. It turned out to be the book he most regretted opening in his life, a writer narrating his daughter's story. The girl was born with an incurable disease and passed away just after 1 year old. Dongfeng, after turning a few pages, felt something was wrong. Terrified, he dropped the book like a hot potato. Back at home, he began calling his daughter Wanwan. Shenlan asked him why, and he avoided answering. But after a couple of days, he began to feel ridiculous. How many girls under the sun were called Niuniu, after all? And what was in a name? And sharing a name. But a few days later, Niuniu went to a hospital for checkup, and Dongfeng filled with dread. By the time he got the results, he was weak in the knees. Of course, it was all for nothing. Niuniu couldn't have been healthier. He let go of the senseless fear and started calling her Niuniu again. She continued to grow on schedule, merging harmoniously with her parents' life. Impartially, she could not be reckoned beautiful. She was a few centimeters shorter than children her age, her hair sparse, eyes not large, nose a bit sunken, but what did these things matter? She was adorable beyond description when she smiled and could melt anyone's heart. She was the product of that rainy evening's tender affection. It was as if Dongfeng and Shenlan had met entirely for the sake of birthing the world's most enchanting fairy. And now, as before, she drinks milk. She plays a while, turns to her father for a bit, then pats her mama, and at last slowly closes her eyes. Her long lashes hang down. She nestles again her parents and sleeps. Shenlan gazes into her hand device a while, then turns off the light and closes her eyes. But Dongfeng can't sleep. He listens in the dark. Shenlan's irregular breaths gradually tend towards even and long. When he judges her sound asleep, he gathers up Niuniu and gets out of bed. In the bathroom, he turns on the light. Niuniu opens her eyes, not fully awake. Her little mouth opens and says, "Papa." Dongfeng reassures her and changes her diaper. There is no mess, of course. The white milk remained in her body a while and just drained out. She has not defecated. If she did, cleanup would only be slightly more complicated. It would come out in a long, narrow piece, but dehydrated and lacking any foul odor. In fact, raising this creature could be much simpler. For instance, they don't need to feed her at all, but Shenlan insists on it. Diaper changed, he takes Niuniu to the sofa and places her on his lap, facing away. Niuniu fusses, twisting her body, babbling, fiddling with her feet. Dongfeng reaches for the back of her head. In her delicate hair, he flips something twice. The back of her head pops open, revealing a deep battery compartment. He digs out the 2 batteries, leaving her head half empty. Niuniu's vitality is gone. Her body goes limp. She falls over in his lap. When he first started changing her batteries, his hands would weaken or tremble. But for a long time now, he's been doing the job with the ease of experience. He puts the batteries in their charger, goes to the closet, retrieves 2 spares, and returns to the sofa. But instead of replacing her batteries, he just stares down at her little body, lying there motionless, just like on that day of finality. Dongfeng suffers a familiar unease. He struggles to escape it, but he's already been dragged into a swamp of memory and anguish. 4. It happened the day before Niuniu's 2nd birthday. Her paternal grandfather and grandmother were coming over for her birthday, so Shenlan decided to clean the apartment. Unfortunately, the nanny had asked for leave that day. Dongfeng was working overtime, so Shenlan was on her own caring for the child while doing housework. A tiny drone followed Niuniu, always hovering a meter or so before her eyes. The drone was the size of a hummingbird with a cam on top. This hummingbird device had been developed mainly for monitoring children. Not all nannies were reliable, and parents, naturally treasuring their children, liked being able to keep a continual eye on things and set their minds at ease. Of course, it was good for more than that. The cam fed to Dongfeng's office computer. He could check the window at the bottom of his screen at any time. Halfway across the city, he could see his daughter's smiling face and be reminded why he was earning money. For a good kindergarten next year, for instance, and thus renewed his diligence. So Dongfeng and Shenlan saw what happened simultaneously. Niuniu was on a plastic mat in the living room playing with smart blocks. These newly developed toys could shapeshift and assemble on their own, becoming fantastic oddities of every sort. They had been occupying Niuniu for 2 hours straight, allowing Shenlan to feel at ease doing housework, and the hummingbird was on duty. If anything dangerous were about to happen, it would issue an alarm. In order to sweep, Shenlan had dragged a chair to the bay window. She had also opened the casement for ventilation. After a while, Niuniu lifted her head toward the window. An interesting notion clearly flashed through her mind. She giggled, stood up, and rushed over, babbling nonstop. Dongfeng sung this. The hummingbird was aimed at Niuniu's face, not the back of her head. He couldn't see her aim, and he wasn't paying much attention anyway, with a financial report on hand urgently needing completion. Niuniu had never climbed onto a chair before. Moreover, the bay window was childproof with a guardrail. By any measure, an accident was nearly impossible, but Niuniu had been growing every day, getting stronger. She climbed onto the chair, and from there was able to climb over the guardrail. She went to the window ledge, toward unfamiliar territory, toward exploration. By the time Shenlan saw what was happening, Niuniu had done 1 foot across the sill. She stepped onto the open casement. There was no barrier between her and the outside world. Having accomplished these virtuoso maneuvers, she was quite pleased with herself. Turning toward Shenlan, she smiled sweetly. "Mama," she called out, wanting Shenlan to witness her magnificent feat. Shenlan turned, saw the shocking tableau, and rushed toward her daughter. In 2 or 3 steps, she reached for the bay window and grabbed for Niuniu's arm. Meanwhile, at work, Dongfeng's gaze drifted to the hummingbird window. He saw, and his trembling hand dropped a mug of coffee, which shattered on the floor. Tragedy still might have been averted, but just then the hummingbird made a mistake. Its expert system finally judged Niuniu to be in danger. It flashed a piercing red light and a sharp, blaring alarm. This had an effect opposite to what was intended. Niuniu flinched away from the noise and light, toward the outside. Her delicate balance was broken. Her tiny form vanished from the 7th floor window. Shenlan reached for her tiny hand and grabbed air. Shrieking, Shenlan collapsed beside the window. And yet, she was somewhat luckier than Dongfeng, who followed Niuniu, the diving drone, and mute witness to his daughter's final moments. The building exterior rushed past the lens. Pedestrians and vehicles swiftly loomed like a horrifying special events scene in a movie. Niuniu's eyes reflected the white clouds above. She still didn't understand what was happening, but was clearly terrified, flailing her limbs, mouth open to cry out. Always before, crying had conjured loved ones, a tender embrace and care. This time, it wasn't to be. Earth rushed toward the lens. A heavy crashing sound followed. Niuniu's expression was forever frozen in that moment before crying out, scarlet quickly filling the other side of the frame. Remembering all of this now, Dongfeng is on the verge of collapse. He supports himself on the tea table beside the sofa. He closes his eyes and opens them again. Closed, his daughter back then. Open, this Niuniu on the sofa before him. They are the same, almost impossible to differentiate. But Niuniu is dead, Dongfeng thinks, cremated, interred by him personally. But her image is always here, unceasingly calling to mind what he can't stand recalling. Day in and day out, year after year. What kind of cruel life is this? Why does he still endure it? Fury wells up. He grabs the little girl's neck and lifts her off the sofa with one hand. "You're not my Niuniu," he says, fuming. "You never were. You're fake. You're a scam." He wouldn't have to squeeze hard to snap her neck, the weakest part of her body, but the delicate neck has human body temperature if no pulse. The girl's eyes are closed. Her face is peaceful, like in sleep or repose in utero. No one could be hard-hearted enough to hurt such a weak child, whether she's real or fake. The strength drains from Dongfeng's arm. Sighing deeply, he tosses her back on the sofa. He loads the spare batteries into her head, cursing under his breath and closing the panel. Niuniu comes to life, turns over, crawls toward him, calling, "Papa, Papa." For a long time now, this voice has been like a siren song, bewildering him, enticing him towards time's abyss. "You're not Niuniu," Dongfeng murmurs. "You can't fool me anymore." Niuniu blinks innocently and again says, "Papa." 5. After the accident, most of the pressure came down on Shenlan's head. Niuniu had fallen on her watch after all. Police took her away amid her neighbors' whisperings. She stared blankly like she didn't understand what had happened. She was nearly prosecuted for homicide by criminal negligence, but the police eventually abandoned this. Dongfeng met her as she came out, hair disheveled in a trance, wan and sallow, almost otherworldly. "Dongfeng," she said, seizing his arm and weeping. "You have to believe me. It wasn't on purpose. I really didn't expect. I was so foolish. I want to die. Your parents surely blame me, right? Do you blame me?" Dongfeng turned away and hoarsely said, "Forget it. All of this is fate. As for my parents, well, I've spoken with them. They're going back to their hometown." He didn't mention his father's hypertension flare-up and hospitalization. "That's fine then." Shenlan seemed to relax and breathe, dabbing at her eyes. "So how is Niuniu? At the hospital, right? Will she be scarred from the fall? She hasn't seen me for a few days. Does she miss me?" Dongfeng stopped in his tracks, stunned and staring at his wife. "What's wrong? Is there something on my face?" "Don't tell me you don't know. Niuniu—" "Never mind," Shenlan interrupted, growing nervous. "I'm sure she's all right, at home waiting for me, right? We should get back. Let's hurry. Let's go home." Dongfeng briefly dared to think it was his own mistake. Niuniu was fine. Nothing had happened. It had been a nightmare. In a trance, he followed Shenlan home, earnestly hoping to see the nanny holding Niuniu. But there was no trace of her. Her diapers, clothes, toys, and drawing pads were scattered everywhere. It seemed she would jump out from her bedroom or from behind the sofa at any moment. He hadn't dared stay home the past few days. Everything was as it had been before the accident. Shenlan entered, and without taking a moment to rest, began putting things in order. She even started cleaning Niuniu's toys. Dongfeng composed himself and gathered his resolve. "Lan, what are you doing? Niuniu's... she's..." He couldn't say it. "She went with your parents." Shenlan looked up at Dongfeng. "And they'll return in a few days, right?" Her tone was superficially calm, yet contained a faint tremor. There was desperate hope in her eyes, like someone dying of thirst, begging for just one drop. Dongfeng wanted to shout at her to stop. He wanted to curse her and vent his fury. "Stop fooling yourself," he wanted to scream, but in the end he averted his gaze. "Yeah, they'll take care of her a while and then bring her back." He called on an old classmate who now worked in a psychiatric ward, seeking advice on his wife's situation. The classmate said Shenlan was in temporary denial. If he could just keep from provoking her, she would get better after a while. Dongfeng understood Shenlan. He could barely accept the truth himself, but time would expose all illusions, heal all wounds, and make everyone face the truth. She just needed time. Not long afterward, he was passing by that cafe and suddenly decided to go in for another look at Niuniu. Intriguingly, this book had so frightened him before now gave him consolation. His Niuniu had gone fast in an instant. She wouldn't have known anything or thought anything. Everything had just ended. From her perspective, it had been like going to sleep. She wouldn't have suffered. At least she was more fortunate than the girl in the book tortured by serious disease. Years later, he reckons life is just unceasing death. He sometimes sees photos of his 2 or 3-year-old self, recalls his parents' tales of that time, but he can't remember any of it. He lived in a small southern town back then. The first language he learned was a pleasant-sounding Wu dialect, but at age 4 he moved north with his parents. He spoke standard Mandarin for a long time. Sometimes he returns to his hometown and hears the old dialect and barely understands it. The Dongfeng of that time, innocent and young, full of southern colloquialisms, no longer exists naturally. They're all gone. Childhood Dongfeng, adolescent Dongfeng, even pre-Shenlan Dongfeng. If Niuniu had lived, she would be 6 or 7 years old, vivaciously attending school, not this wobbly walking infant. So the Niuniu of back then is as good as dead, replaced by a series of new Niunius. What is there to feel bad about? But Dongfeng knows this for sophistry. He has lost many Niunius, not just one. 3-year-old Niuniu, 5-year-old Niuniu, 10-year-old. It's like they fled against the flow of time, sweeping past Dongfeng and Shenlan, faces unclear, one after another back into the unrecoverable past, back to that plummeting child, and vanished like smoke. Life is so long, Dongfeng thinks. In the future, he will have more brushes with Niunius who might have been 15-year-old Niuniu. No. At what point she would be called Dong Xinghuan, 20-year-old Dong Xinghuang, 30-year-olds, 40. They'll have their lives and careers, dispositions and attachments and joys and griefs as they sweep by, passing from the points in time he would have met them, returning to the past, to that tragic moment, the instant in which they ceased to exist. But he finds a new kind of solace in this pain. It is as if there's another world where Niuniu is growing up to adulthood. Perhaps the world at that tragic moment split in two. In one, Shenlan grabbed Niuniu, averting the horror that might have followed. Unfortunately, he fell to the other world and is thus separated from Niuniu. They're gradually getting further apart, never to meet again, but in each other's worlds they will both have new lives. Nothing like the one he's currently living. Niuniu still fidgets next to him. Dongfeng twists her ear, half a turn, and she falls asleep. He installed the shortcut without telling Shenlan. She couldn't bear him treating his daughter like a toy. He carries her back to the bedroom and lays her down. Shenlan blearily embraces her. Niuniu needs a battery change once a day. She can also charge up directly, but that takes longer. Changing batteries is visually unpleasant but necessary. Dongfeng can only do it when Shenlan sleeps. For years now, she has never awakened during these changings. He sometimes feels she is deliberate in this, or at least subconsciously conspiring. She can't face the truth, though she's well aware of it. Dongfeng lies down beside them. He stares into impenetrable darkness and can't sleep most of the night. It's not the first time, and it's getting more common. Every time the insomnia comes with a name, the name of someone who has never existed, yet it won't fade from his mind. Dong Xinghuan. 6. The second time Dongfeng thought of this name was half a year after Niuniu passed. For him, Shenlan's hysteria was not entirely a bad thing. He could at least escape his grief in psychology and psychiatry texts, seeking a way to cure his wife. The first step was to pack up Niuniu's things. He told Shenlan he would send them to his parents' place, since Niuniu's stay was becoming extended. Shenlan did not stop him, nor did she contact her in-laws to request a video call with Niuniu. Dongfeng sensed his classmate had been right. Deep down, Shenlan knew what had happened. She just couldn't accept it. With Niuniu's things and toys packed up in a dozen or so boxes, Dongfeng found he couldn't throw them out like he'd meant to. It was too painful. He finally put them in a corner of the storage room. Shenlan brought up Niuniu less and less. For a long time, she just stared at the photos of Niuniu on the wall. Dongfeng eventually sounded her out on taking them down, and she said nothing. Later, he saw her staring at the blank wall and wiping away tears. Neither of them mentioned Niuniu's death, but Dongfeng sensed Shenlan had accepted the fact of it. Their home was restored to its pre-Niuniu state. Dongfeng recalled their life before her not so long ago, yet seemingly a lifetime passed. In his sadness, Dongfeng also knew a bit of ease. Their marriage had returned to its starting point. They could set off on the journey once more. He began propositioning Shenlan. She was not enthusiastic, but she allowed nature to take its course. They continued that way once or twice a month, colorless unions, meager fare, indifferent, both parties mostly silent, as though all desire was dead, and all that remained was desire's corpse. Yet in bed, the marriage more or less recovered its most fundamental significance. They were no longer new parents, just a man and a woman, not so old, able to find temporary happiness in each other's bodies. Of course, Dongfeng began to wonder if something else might result. He didn't know when it started, but the name Dong Shihuan was on his mind by then. He thought perhaps it was not merely a name, but a premonition. Perhaps he could still bring this child into the world and quell their pain. Perhaps Niuniu and all that had happened was a mere interlude, and Dong Shihuan would be the resplendent symphonic movement. A boy named Shihuan, meaning imposing man. It might not be a boy, of course. Change out the characters, and Shihuan became Daylily Palm. A boy or girl could rescue their life. A new child. But giving birth to a child was not yet a formal item on their agenda. Dongfeng knew it wasn't urgent and that Shenlan wasn't yet ready. The predestined child would have to wait for a better opportunity to come into their lives. He began to carefully plan an ocean cruise for them. It would start in the Southern Pacific, including numerous island nations, and enriching their experience with foreign customs. They had originally planned this as their honeymoon trip, but due to a shortage of funds, they'd abandoned it. Now, with the plan revived, Shenlan's enthusiasm was immediately apparent. Dongfeng saw the luster of youth return to her eyes, which had long been dormant. This excited him further. For many days, they discussed what they should bring, where they would go, what they would do for fun, what they would eat, and talking of happy times, they were filled with laughter like two children. Dongfeng yearned for the stream-like trip. They would spend 2 months in warm southern winds, passing across blue, refreshing seas, accompanied by cetaceans during the day and the dazzling Milky Way by night. They would land on foreign coasts and appreciate radically different lifestyles. They might even make love on tempestuous seas or kiss on uninhabited white beaches. Life would glow with splendor once more and soar over new horizons. One night, 3 days before they were to set off, Dongfeng was working overtime to get everything done before the trip. Around 9, after numerous meetings, he was finished and discovered an unfamiliar number had called him 7 or 8 times. He'd had his device on mute. He tried to call back but just couldn't. He didn't pay this much mind. Most likely, it was a work matter. He just hoped it wouldn't interfere with the trip. He returned home, not in the least on guard. He opened the door to find a middle-aged woman standing before him, hair gone partially white, vaguely familiar, and a relative, perhaps. "You're..." The woman smiled faintly. "Mr. Dong, don't you remember me?" Her voice was deep and rich, singularly magnetic, and quite familiar, very much like his paternal grandmother's. Suddenly, he knew where he'd met her. It had been almost a year ago. He had nearly come to think of it as a dream. You're... Don't tell me. Papa. A child's voice behind the woman, young and tender and resonant. It couldn't have been more familiar. It had invaded his dreams thousands of times, woke him with a start at midnight to find tears on his pillow. Dizzy, forgetting all else, he went like a sleepwalker toward the voice. The woman moved aside conscientiously. Dongfeng saw Shenlan standing there, cheeks tear-stained, yet smiling beautifully. She was hugging a small girl. This child called him Papa and extended tiny arms toward him. Niuniu, he said. Niuniu, he heard himself say. Niuniu, Niuniu. He dropped his briefcase and rushed toward mother and daughter. He embraced them, crying. In that moment, he was happy beyond words. Work, travel, Dong, Shihuan, all were unimportant. Niuniu had returned. The vanished era of joy had returned. His family was complete again. This was life's highest and only meaning. But all that was 4 years ago, and he'd been wrong. Opening his eyes, Dongfeng thinks, I was gravely mistaken. He finally got to sleep around 5 or 6 in the morning. Now it's close to 9. Luckily, it's Saturday and he doesn't have to work. He hears the child's piercing voice in the kitchen. Dongfeng goes out and sees breakfast leftovers on the table. Niuniu has eaten. Shenlan is putting a pretty pink dress on her, meaning to take her downstairs to play in the park. Niuniu dances with anticipation. It's a familiar scene to Dongfeng. Mama, kitty cat, Dongfeng thinks. Mama, Niuniu says, pointing out the door. Kitty cat. She wants to go out and see the cat. Actually, she can't distinguish between cats and dogs. Shenlan croons a lively song, placing Niuniu in the stroller. She buckles the safety belt and kisses the child's forehead. Tee. Tee. Niuniu laughs. Ho, ho, ho. Oh. Niuniu happily hoots. Now wave your hands. Niuniu lifts her arms, excitedly flailing them. Dongfeng knows each seemingly careless movement and vocalization is controlled, precise as mathematics. Len, he can't help saying, we need to talk. When we get back, okay? She squats to adjust Niuniu's clothes as the child fusses in the stroller. Dongfeng wants to say more but resists. Irritation washes over him like background noise. He sees a bright red apple on the table and picks it up. He brings it toward his mouth. Shenlan rushes over and snatches it. Come on. I'm bringing it for Niuniu. Are you competing with your daughter for food now? Dongfeng can no longer suppress his annoyance. Daughter? He blurts. Whose daughter? Are you crazy? Shenlan says, not meeting his gaze as she heads out. What are you smoking anyway? What are you talking about? You know what I'm talking about. She's not really your daughter. She's not really a person. Shenlan's glance is dismal. Don't go there, she says, voice low but firm. Not now. To me, she is Niuniu, and that's good enough. Dongfeng finally erupts. Stop fucking lying to yourself, okay? Niuniu wasn't doomed to be an infant forever. Niuniu couldn't retract teeth after growing them. She didn't learn to walk, then go back to crawling. We both know this is just a machine, a doll. You still take her to the park. Don't you know what the neighbors and security guards say about us behind our backs? I've had enough. Dongfeng's uproar triggers bawling from Niuniu. She extends her little arms, seeking her mother's bosom. Shenlan hastily retrieves her from the stroller, softly consoling her. Niuniu sees her mother's tears and gets even more upset. Dongfeng's fury is extinguished as if by a bucket of water. There's still steam, but the fire is out. Tender, fatherly love refills his heart. He knows this is a misconception, but he can't help it. And he hates himself all the more for it. Wiping away tears, Shenlan glares at him. As though evading terrible danger, she hugs Niuniu and goes out the door, kicking it closed with a bang. Dongfeng listens to her footfalls rapidly fade. How did it come to this, he wonders. It all began with a seeming miracle. Niuniu came back, didn't she? But the price was dreadful. Now they're trapped in a long-gone past, unable to escape as if they've fallen into the warped space-time of a black hole. If he hadn't taken the woman's offer in the first place, everything might have been difficult. 7. On the day he interred Niuniu's ashes, it was also raining. Shenlan was in no condition to join him, and his parents were unwell. Dongfeng was on his own, managing everything. He didn't know how he was sustaining the rush to get it all over with. After the cinerary casket had been entombed, a heavy rain fell from the sky. Dongfeng stood gazing at the photo of Niuniu that had just been affixed to the facade. This is her home from now on, he thought. Can the rain get in? Will Niuniu freeze? Will she be afraid if she hears thunder? Can she reach out for a hug in there? No one would come and hold her anymore. No one would tuck her in at night. Would she be wondering how to come home? Could she find her way home? The rain soaked his clothes. Tears flowed, mingling with rainwater. Soon he was weeping and choking. Someone patted his shoulder and gave him a tissue. Dongfeng looked up to see a silver-haired woman holding an umbrella. She wore a gray pantsuit and her face was kind. Are you all right, sir? She said. Dongfeng guessed she worked for the cemetery. My daughter is dead, he sobbed. She wasn't even 2. The woman sighed. I'm sure she was precious to you. Her voice was slightly husky, sonorous, reminding Dongfeng of his long-gone paternal grandmother. She led Dongfeng into a lobby. Not sure why, he began telling her Niuniu's story. From mother's womb to the ultimate fall, he said it all, things he didn't wish to recall, things only Niuniu's parents would be interested in. He kept it all inside for too long. He certainly hadn't been able to talk to Shenlan. The more he talked now, the more he wanted to say, the less he could control himself. The woman listened, now and then passing him a tissue. It took quite a while to say it all. He began to calm down. He wiped away tears and forced an embarrassed smile. Sorry, miss. I think I've been wasting your time. It's fine, she said. I actually came here to find you. Dongfeng was nonplussed. Excuse me? Listen, if I were to tell you there was a way to see your Niuniu again, how would that be? Dongfeng stared a bit. His temper rose and he glared at the woman. What the hell do you mean? Not alarmed, the woman said, I'm not trying to make you feel better in this moment, and I'm not out of my mind. But I have a way for you to see Niuniu again, an exact copy of her. How is that possible? Saying this, Dongfeng suddenly understood. Hold on. You can't be talking about an artificial person. The woman nodded. He knew artificial person tech had been developing a long time. Several years before, there'd been a breakthrough combining a metal skeleton, an AI chip, and a fabricated human tissue exterior. The result was a living robot that could pass as human. At first, welcomed by the marketplace, this tech soon developed a bad reputation. Most consumers were ordering custom-made beauties, young men and women for satisfying secret longings. As one might imagine, some satisfaction modes were quite abnormal, giving rise to many controversies. Some models were even meant to resemble celebrities. These and other types meant to mimic real people led to legal disputes. Finally, the government prohibited artificial person production. But demand was still high, and underground industry persisted. Dongfeng had never imagined these would have anything to do with him. He recovered his faculties. Sorry, I don't need that. She wouldn't be a real person. Of course not, the woman said, compellingly unperturbed. But you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You said when you close your eyes, you would still see her. I guarantee our Niuniu will be an exact replica. An exact replica? Dongfeng shook his head. It's impossible. Not at all. You just have to provide enough viable image data. Our modeling is precise. Using the latest nanometer grade 3D printing tech, we control every detail of skin and hair. I won't bore you with the technical details. Suffice it to say, you'd see her sweet smile, you'd hear her call you Papa. She would kiss your cheek and you'd hold her hand as she learned to walk and play. She would be with you forever. Never to be taken away again. Dongfeng backed up a few steps as if his daughter were rushing toward him, laughing and happy. He waved a hand, dispersing the sweet illusion. But she wouldn't be real. That's true, the woman said, patient and unflappable. But she'd still be a three-dimensional photograph, a living sculpture. Wouldn't that be the best possible commemoration of Niuniu? It's still a no. Dongfeng struggled to resist ever greater enticement. I know producing an artificial human is very expensive. We don't have that kind of money. The woman smiled, as if she'd anticipated these grounds for refusal. Not as pricey as you might think. Quite doable for you. Moreover, you wouldn't need to pay anything up front. You just register, transfer Niuniu's data to us, and sit tight. We send the new Niuniu to your residence, and you pay later. Unsatisfied in any way, return her within a month and pay nothing. And aren't you operating at a huge loss? Dongfeng couldn't fathom their business model. Not to worry, the woman smiled sincerely. Customer satisfaction is our highest priority. In the end, Dongfeng surprised himself by registering. He sent all his photos and videos of Niuniu to the appointed web address. He waited, but it was like the company had vanished into thin air. There was no further news. Dongfeng reckoned the underground factory had been raided and shut down. Luckily, it hadn't touched him. He soon forgot the matter, until the night he found that woman in his home and came to understand why she hadn't taken advance payment. There was almost no risk to this business. Seeing a loved one return, nobody could return the goods, even if it meant bankruptcy. And the cost was indeed high. They had to cancel their travel plans, in addition to maxing out several credit cards. But what did these things matter? Little Niuniu had returned. They were immersed in bliss for an entire year. Shenlan's child-rear glow returned, and their former life trajectory recapitulated. Niuniu seemed to grow all over again, from baby to young child, slowly learning to walk and master a few simple words and phrases. But one day she was back to where she started. Dongfeng called to inquire about this. An imitation person was a machine, in essence. With imitation children, this was all the more evident. They couldn't really grow. At best, the machine skeleton could expand or contract in limited ways. Muscles could transform somewhat. Teeth could emerge from and retreat into gums. A 1-year-old could grow to look like 2 or so at most. Of course, they couldn't grow up. AI algorithms with limb and trunk control made limited change possible, from crawling to walking, babbling to a few simple sentences. But this sort of development was unsustainable. In the end, the machine could be fixed at its terminal stage or cycled back and allowed to grow once more. Shenlan chose the latter, perhaps because it meant more child-rearing pleasure. It had been 4 years since the new Niuniu's arrival for 4 growth cycles. During the first year, Dongfeng's love of the child was no less than it had been toward the real Niuniu. His feelings cooled during the second year, but he was still quite taken with her. In the third year, he grew wearier of the game day by day. Finally, in his 4th year, he feels he will soon go mad. It's like he's fallen into a restless, never-ending time loop. Niuniu, having just learned to walk, goes back to self-satisfied crawling. She learns to speak, and just like that, forgets it all. Every day recapitulates what happened on the corresponding day in years 1, 2, and 3, and even 5 years ago with the real Niuniu. But the days crawl on, his hair going gray, his parents having passed away. And that lifelike person, forever between 1 and 2 years old, never to grow up, plays ever more preposterous parent-child games with them. And when will such days end? When will he and Shenlan be able to see the future? Shenlan is still invested. She has no problem repeating the cycle. with a machine to take care of, she doesn't even want a second pregnancy. Let's wait a while, she always says. Now is not the time. Of course, Niuniu is stuck at the age she needs the most care. Her needs will never end because she will never grow up. The opportune moment to get pregnant to create Dong Shihuan is endlessly postponed. Perhaps it will never come. There has to be a conclusion. This morning, it couldn't be clearer to Dongfeng. This absurd game is consuming their lives and non-existent Dong Shihuan's life. It must end. 8. Shenlan is gone for a long time. Dongfeng calls and no one answers. She doesn't come back with Niuniu until late afternoon. The door opens and the tiny form comes waddling in. "Papa! Papa!" she shouts, throwing herself into Dongfeng's arms. She has obviously forgotten Dongfeng's morning rant. Of course, she doesn't really remember anything, running on fixed routines. Dongfeng picks her up, harboring mixed emotions. Shenlan comes toward him, expression serene. "You wanted to talk? Let's talk." Dongfeng puts Niuniu down and points at the smart blocks on the floor. Niuniu rushes over in high spirits and starts playing. Dongfeng leads Shenlan into the study, partially shutting the door. "Sorry," he said. "My words might be a bit jarring, but that child is..." "Relax. I'm not crazy. I know she's not a real person, but so what? Damn it, Dongfeng. Can't you just let me raise her like a little pet?" "If she really was a pet, that'd be fine, but you treat her like a daughter. You call her Niuniu. You give her powdered milk just like Niuniu. Our Niuniu used to get the same high-end dietary supplements, the same fruit and veg. She doesn't need any of it. You get her the best toys. You take her out for walks. You cuddle her to sleep. You work harder than a nanny. Lan, you've neglected your career for 4 years to stay at home and wait upon an artificial person. Don't you think that's a bit much?" "A bit much? I just really like her. I like caring for her. What's wrong with that? You often neglect food and sleep, playing your VR games, don't you?" Dongfeng doesn't know how to respond to this incongruous analogy. "I like her too, you know that. I'm not opposed to having her in our home, but we're not young anymore. We need to start a new life, a better life. I've wanted a child all these years, a boy or a girl, one who isn't Niuniu, who can grow up and go to school, but you... Every time I want another child too." Shenlan's voice begins to tremble, tears flowing. "I want a child who can grow up, but I keep thinking, with a new kid growing up and going to school and us with a new life, what will become of Niuniu? There won't be time to care for her. How will the new child regard this older sister? Don't tell me we would treat her like an old toy, throw her in a closet, take her out for Spring Festival and other holidays. We can't do that to her." "Here we go again." Dongfeng is shaking. "You keep thinking of her as a real person. You keep considering her feelings. That's precisely your problem. She's not real. She can't even be regarded as an android." "Nonsense. She might not be too clever, but she's like Niuniu. I don't know how to say it. I do. Subconsciously, at least, you feel she's alive, like in those sci-fi movies, a robot with human nature, but it's delusional. She's just a machine and not even a clever one." Shenlan's gaze is cold. "Whatever. I don't see it." "Fine," Dongfeng nods. "I'll prove it to you. I'll show you what this child really is." He pulls up a video on his device. "Remember? This was 5 years ago, our Niuniu playing with those shape-changing blocks. She built a little pyramid and we praised her cleverness. Now look at this, Niuniu. She's doing the same thing, like 2 peas in a pod. Look, almost exactly the same, movement for movement. Look!" Drops the blue block and picks it back up. "See, isn't it exactly the same?" Shenlan, growing pale, looks from the video to her proximate Niuniu. "This is the truth," Dongfeng says. 4 years ago, I transferred all videos of Niuniu to that underground factory, all that we recorded, and thousands of hours from the hummingbird, nearly half her life. They restored Niuniu based on this data. Her appearance, obviously, but also inside. Later, I researched the tech, the big data analysis, the psychological modeling, core personality reconstruction. It's deceiving, sly nonsense. They just took all the content and put it in a database. Simple instructions mix these ready-made responses. For instance, see Papa and run for a hug, see Mama and want to suckle, like that. At best, minor adjustments are carried out based on the environment. This Niuniu is neither a person nor an AI. She has no personality. She's just, may sound funny, a 3D video of Niuniu's life. A video? Shenlan sneers as if fundamentally refusing to believe. Yes, a video! Honestly, this past year I've been watching her very carefully. Everything she does, every movement replicates something Niuniu did. Whenever she's in an environment corresponding to back then, she proceeds based on the source video. The data is rich, of course, so it's not easy to perceive at a glance. For instance, Niuniu has about a dozen anger modes. For crying, it's 30-odd. Laughing, more than 50. Combine all the types and the number gets astronomical. But it's based on our Niuniu, on what happened to our Niuniu. There's nothing new. It's all replication. Reconstruction. But because infants at this stage of development are all generally similar in their language, movement, and reactions, we don't really perceive it. A breathless Dongfeng, having rendered his verdict, noticed Shenlan isn't as shocked as he imagined she would be. Is that all? She says dully. Is it not enough? I already knew. I mean, it's ridiculous. How long did you take care of her? What about me? You left early every morning and came home late. I was by her side all day. You really think I didn't notice her speech and actions were completely identical to Niuniu's? You think her underlying mechanisms weren't obvious to me? Everything you've said I already knew. But all that is why I love her. But that's ridiculous. Don't you understand? Shenlan nods at the little girl, amusing herself beyond the glass door. If she were some top-notch imitation human, with independent personality and emotion algorithms, maybe I wouldn't feel like this, but she's a time machine. She takes us back to the times with Niuniu. Every word, every movement, every smile, it's all just like Niuniu's. We never let go of Niuniu. She's been with us all along. 9. Dongfeng glares at his wife, panic-stricken. It was like he couldn't recognize her. For a while, he was at a loss. So, you really do know all this better than me. You know but to choose to stay in the past. Seal yourself away in memories of Niuniu. But why, ultimately? How about an example? Shenlan smiles bitterly, wretchedly. Maybe you don't know, but one time back then, Niuniu woke from a nap and no one was with her. The nanny had not arrived. I was in the shower with music and she cried, louder and louder, getting terribly desperate, practically passing out from crying. After a while, I just barely heard her. I didn't even get dressed, just rushed out to pick her up. I consoled her for an hour and she just wouldn't quit crying. Well, not long ago, the scene happened again. I heard her calling out, the cadence the same, every undulation precise. It was Niuniu calling out again. What could I do? Just like back then, I went out and I picked her up and consoled her. In that moment, she was my daughter. I noticed you growing colder toward her over the past couple of years. I noticed long ago, cold, even cruel. But she still loves you, still so attached to you. Regardless of how hard she's crying, one hug from you does the trick. This wouldn't be possible with another child, and why? Because she is our Niuniu from back then. She loves you as Niuniu did. There's no difference at all. She loves you way more than she loves me. How can you let her down? Dongfeng suffers vertigo. Can it be that Niuniu has really traversed time? Has she come back to him via this artificial body? No, it's irrational. He can't be deceived. Don't try to fool me like you fool yourself. No matter how accurately she recreates Niuniu's actions and speech, she has no real feelings, no inner life. She's a shadow, a reflection. You and I can't keep watch over a shadow over our whole lives. We have to let her go. You don't get it. I can't let her go. To each their own. Just don't try to force me, okay? How about you don't force me? Dongfeng roars, driven beyond forbearance. Of course I know you can't let her go. I've talked to psychologists. I know why, because that day, which we never bring up. Don't say it, Shenlan interrupts, voice trembling. I could leave it alone, but we're both well aware, aren't we? That day Niuniu fell, it was entirely your... Don't you say it. Shenlan is growing frenzied. Niuniu turns to regard them with doubt and fear. Shenlan heads for the living room, but Dongfeng pulls her to a halt and firmly shuts the study door. It's a special kind of glass, soundproof, so Niuniu can't hear them. She stares a few seconds more, then returns to her solitary play. Still not ready to face it, Dongfeng says, ruthless, unaware of his secret thrill, as if a long-confirmed demon is finally breaking free. You sealed yourself off in a year of Niuniu memories, but you never visited that last day. Because you can't go there. You just go round and round, repeating the cycle, raising her over and over. But it's useless. We've always lived inside that day. We can't leave it, and I fucking had enough. This is your problem now. Why should I keep following you? You've got to face it head on now. Face it. Shenlan struggles in his grip. What do you mean? She looks to the living room, avoiding Dongfeng's gaze. Why did you put the chair there? What is this? What do you want from... Dongfeng clicks a remote control, and the casement of the bay window drifts open. This gets Niuniu's attention. Her computer chip brain rapidly conducts a database search, finds a matching section of memory, activates a movement subroutine. She stands up and waddles toward the chair. You fucking psycho! Shenlan cries. What are you doing? Let go of me! Dongfeng maintains his grip, his other hand covering her mouth. He feels demonic, but he's a joyful demon. You have to face this. Face everything you created. I can't bear the load forever. Look. Look! That day, your stupidity led to our daughter's death. Niuniu can't hear them. In no time, she has climbed onto the chair. Then she climbs the guardrail, and she's in the window bay. Dongfeng saw it with his own eyes back then. Now he sees it from a new angle, as if he's time-traveled back to that day 5 years ago. Shenlan stares, dumbfounded and paralyzed. This is the penultimate scene, Dongfeng thinks. Soon it will finally be finished, and they'll be able to start over. Goodbye, Niuniu. This time for real. Goodbye. Niuniu climbs onto the windowsill. She looks over her shoulder, smiling sweetly at her parents. Dongfeng suddenly realizes he forgot something. This time there is no hummingbird drone, no final trigger of tragedy. Let it be, he thinks. Maybe this is enough. Amid this distraction, Shenlan renews her struggle, breaks free, pushing him into a bookshelf. She flings open the door and charges toward the window. Niuniu. She leaps the railing and lands on the window bay. She reaches for the girl on the windowsill. In that moment, she too has crossed endless time, back the decisive moment of 5 years before, meaning to change the iron fact of tragic predestination. Face savage, moved by maternal instinct, she has resolved to prevail, to change everything. And this triggers Niuniu's final reaction. Seemingly terrified, shrinking from Shenlan, she leans back. No! Shenlan shrieks. 5 years ago, after a similar wail, she fainted. But when she woke, the police cruiser had arrived downstairs. This time, it's different. Without hesitation, Shenlan puts a foot beyond the windowsill, pouncing outward. This time she seizes Niuniu, but it's too late. Embracing the little girl, she turns her head, seeming not to understand what's happening. Dongfeng, who has just rushed out of the study, briefly meets her gaze. A moment later, the hem of her fluttering dress vanishes over the windowsill. Dongfeng hears himself screaming. He stumbles toward the window, hears a horrible muffled sound. Leaning out the window, he sees Shenlan far below, so small, lying on the road, her dress going scarlet, the redness expanding. Niuniu lays prostrate on top of her mother, howling, seemingly unaffected by the impact. People close in. Before losing consciousness, Dongfeng sees a faint smile on his wife's face. "10. On that rainy day, the young woman in white had become small with distance. On that fateful day, Young Dongfeng had gone quite far with his umbrella when he turned around, timidly gazing at the girl. She was hazy beyond the intervening fine rain. Mind made up, he headed back. Putting one foot in front of the other, treading through puddles, he drew closer, heart beating faster, as if it would burst from his chest into her embrace. He wasn't sure if she saw him coming because he couldn't look up. He would have to talk to her. May I accompany you home? Or could I lend you my umbrella? How could he talk to her without it sounding abrupt and awkward? Ascending the steps, he was still racking his brain for suitable lines. He wasn't paying attention to his footing. He slid, toppled, lost his umbrella, and landed in a deep puddle, mortified. When he looked up, there she was, extending her hand and smiling faintly. That smile, that face dripping with rain, would be branded on Dongfeng's brain forever, no matter how she changed. In that moment, Dongfeng somehow knew Shenlan would always be a part of his life. Nothing would separate them. Thinking of the past, smiling, Dongfeng opens the front door. Little Niuniu amuses herself beside Shenlan's foot. She sees him, immediately beaming and awkwardly standing up. She staggers toward him, shouting, "Papa!" Dongfeng puts down his briefcase and picks her up. He lifts her high. She shrieks excitedly. "Careful," Shenlan says. "Please don't drop our child." Dongfeng reassures her, and she says, "Hey, didn't you notice?" "Notice what?" "She can walk. Yesterday she could go 2 or 3 steps at most. You saw her do more just now. She can go from one end of the room to the other." Dongfeng puts Niuniu down. She starts walking straight away. She can indeed stride, performing with a high and mighty air, though her knees still don't bend properly, so she can only proceed swaying comically like a penguin. After a few steps, she goes down, but luckily a floor mat cushions her fall. She gets up, snorts, and swinging her arms, continues to stagger. Shenlan shakes with laughter. Dongfeng laughs with her. Her motor neurons are really developing. Maybe she'll grow up to win honor of the country. They give Niuniu a bath, feed her milk together, then bring her to bed for sleep. She drinks a bit more, and they play with her for a while. She turns to her papa's side, then rolls over to pat her mama. Finally, she closes her eyes, long lashes hanging down. Nestled against her parents, she sleeps. Shenlan looks at her device for a bit, chats a little with Dongfeng, then turns off the lamp and closes her eyes. Dongfeng lies in the dark alone, eyes open. He listens to Shenlan's irregular breathing gradually even out. When Shenlan and Niuniu are both asleep, he stealthily rises. He turns their bodies over to lie prone. He opens the backs of their heads and extracts the batteries. He takes the batteries to the recharger and fetches replacements. Mother and daughter resume their gentle breathing. Accompanied by their warm breath, Dongfeng is content. He closes his eyes and enters dreamland. This story was first published in Chinese in Flower City, 5th issue of 2018. It has been translated and published in partnership with Storycom. Now, what are your thoughts on the story? You can leave us a comment or a question at the Clarkesworld Magazine website itself, or you can go to the About Us page where all of our contact information is listed. This has been yet another story here at Clarkesworld. We have many more to come, so I hope that you'll come back and listen to some more, should you so choose. Until then, I bid you a very fond and warm, and hopefully very temporary farewell.